had somebody in the car with me who was kind of like, yeah, man, he's square and everything else. So we roll up to this cat's house. First time I'd met him, little shotgun house. We walk in. There's a couch on the right, coffee table with a gun, scale, some dope, big screen TV. Pretty much nothing else in the house besides that. And then they proceed to sit down while we're chit-chatting, and we're talking about how much I need and this and that. The whole premise of that whole deal, by the way, was for me to hook up the guy that I was riding with, because I'm supposed to be big time. So I'm just throwing this buddy some cash so he can get his hustle going. And I hear a familiar voice in the background and immediately became terrified, because I realized this is back before everyone had 8,000 channels. We had whatever the 3 major networks or 4, and then a couple of UHF channels. And I was on a Cops episode many years prior, and there was my butt on Cops on the big screen TV at the moment that I walked in this house trying to do a deal. So you had mentioned that, you know, I had longer hair, but I was a little shaggy, but I didn't have like actually long hair. I mean, I feel like I looked a lot like I do now, honestly. And that actually terrified me, because I was absolutely unprepared for something like that.
Thanks for having us, and I wanted to introduce Tegan a little bit. This is a great book, and I read the book, and then I met Tegan after I read the book, and we both live in Fort Worth, and Fort Worth is, you know, beautiful neighborhoods, great facilities, great university. And about 10 minutes away from the most beautiful neighborhoods is the most dangerous neighborhoods. And that's where Tegan worked for many, many years. That's where I currently work. And it's mind-blowing what things go on in the Fishbowl. And so I wanted to introduce Tegan, who's done a lot in law enforcement, both as a uniformed police officer and as an undercover police officer. He looks a lot different than what he looks like right now as an undercover. But one thing, just a little background, I don't know if people ever realize he started out as a music major.
Yes.
And so can you talk about your transition from music major to undercover cop working in Fishbowl?
Sure, it's a really quick story. My whole life I was destined to be the new drummer for Kiss or whatever. You know, the 4th grade dream on sent me to North Texas to study music. I studied jazz there with every intention of holding that path. After school, I was on the road for a few years, touring and cutting records and things like that back in the 90s. And eventually had a child and started having second thoughts about the music industry that I had perceived to be what I wanted to do. And perhaps part of it was growing up and changing priorities, but a lot of it was just a discontentment with the music industry itself. So at least the music industry, as it were, on the road as a touring musician at the time anyway. So I had to kind of start my life over. I was 25, 26 years old at that time, and I was already on my path to destiny. So when I decided that I might want to get out of the music business, the whole world was my oyster, and that was kind of part of the advantage that I had, because I didn't have a backup plan or anything like that. I just was choosing from everything, because ever since I can remember, I was supposed to be a professional musician. Had a handful of cops that used to come out and watch me gig at this one particular place, and so I got to know several of them, and just hit me one day that I thought it would be cool to leverage my personality to do undercover work. So even going into police work, my long-term goal was to kind of do some undercover work. I feel like I communicate and relate to a lot of the musicians and artists that I'd grown up with and gone to school with. Lots of drugs and obviously a lot of that kind of stuff going on. And I felt like I kind of fit into different crews. I I never got into drugs or anything, but I certainly hung out with and had good friends who did. And so I felt like I would be a good fit in an undercover role. And that's what I ended up doing. I just ended up cutting off 8 inches of locks and taking the test and had them teach me everything I know about law enforcement, essentially, at that point.
Which you had to grow back your hair, though, once you
A little
went
bit.
undercover.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I was questioning when I read the book for the first time was your target group was a notorious gang called the Crips. They're in their 20s. They're African American, very untrusting of outsiders. You were 36 at the point when you went into, or maybe you're 36 now, but you were a little older than them.
Oh, I wish I was 36 now.
But
No, I was
how do you,
I was in my 30s for sure.
how do you gain trust from that group, looking like you, even if you grow your hair out?
Yeah, well, the objective and the title of the book is Life in the Fishbowl, because the Fishbowl was a coined term by law enforcement for this particular neighborhood that was held hostage by gang violence. There was one way in, one way out, lookouts at every corner, lots of drug activity, and pretty much if you went down in there, you were down there to do business. So my whole approach was to approach it from the angle as a dope dealer instead of a crip, because I didn't quite match it as a crip. I mean, right? In fact, I acted quite ignorant to any of the gang stuff, and that was a way that I got to hear about how they worked and stuff as well. But I leveraged the dope stuff by just saying, hey, you know, I just had my source got busted by the feds on the other side of town, and just imagined in my mind, like, okay, if I'm my real self and I really wanted to just get into the dope game, how would I do it? And so I went in and I really didn't change my personality a whole lot. I just changed the sociopathic kind of tendencies in me towards, you know, acting more like as a tough, versed dope dealer. And essentially, I mean, and I when I use the term dope, I mean, obviously there's a lot of sensitivity to that. That neighborhood was being plagued by the use of dope as part of the enterprise that furthered the gang. So really it was a gang case, and I just used drug dealing in order to infiltrate. And I got a ton of pushback. I mean, obviously it took me a little while to get a lot of trust. I met a few people, and as I've learned in the business world, when it comes to money, people can be convinced to do a lot of different things. So my goal was I started going into this neighborhood and hitting up some of the street level dealers and was asking for, in this case, I would go in and ask for powder cocaine, which the street level dealers did not have any access to. That was 2 levels above them, is who had powder cocaine before they broke it down to crack to sell on the street. So I would just say, look, you know, I'll hook you up with a quick 100. I'll see if I can move it on my side of town. It's not really my thing exactly, but if you'll kind of help me get somebody to give me the powder, it'll be good. And that's kind of the way that I moved myself through. I wasn't too anxious. I was very cautious, as they were. They asked me a bunch of questions. Eventually, I just cut them off and say, look, you know, we're going to do business here, or you're going to ask me a bunch of questions. I'm not going to ask to see your ID. I don't know if you're a cop either, so let's just get down to business. So a lot of it was just acting less like a cop would, about being so overly ambitious that you'll do anything to get a deal done. I was quick to say no, never mind, because they'd ask me too many questions. I'd say, oh, I was going to go somewhere else, and then, you know, obviously they'd want to hail me down and try to convince me to do the deal. So that was just the premise upon which I based my operation in order to get the gang violence away from that neighborhood.
And you talked about how organized it was and how it seemed to be run like a corporation, and how these guys were brilliant businessmen in that way.
Yeah.
And there was also a part in the book where you talk about the whole idea of respect and disrespect. Do you have any stories or any things that you can tell us about their organization, and any kind of instances where you realized that this whole respect thing was a really big deal?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I knew it was organized because I'd worked in the streets before this in a patrol capacity and was learning a lot about the hierarchy and who was doing what. But until I started getting in and just hanging out with these guys and playing Madden and sharing 40s, we really didn't get an appreciation for how deep it went. They were very organized. I compared to business a lot. It's less about what business is this day, where you focus on the culture and it's all about the actual company. It's very hierarchical, and they're very, it's a brutal price to pay, obviously, if you're screwing people over at certain levels. The kingpin that I dealt with in Fort Worth proper, that grew up in Fort Worth East Side, was doing $250,000 a week in product. So you can imagine, with him not really touching the product, how far down that would have to go, and which is why he was so untouchable until somebody could get inside and kind of infiltrate it that way. And one of my first experiences in going to one of the higher level guys' house, I actually was invited to come to the house, and somebody that I didn't know was already at the house, and I brought a little posse with me of one guy that knew who I was and was just kind of an informant that could kind of help me look out, and the other guy was coming along with him that had no idea that either one of us had anything to do with law enforcement. And the rap on the door flies open, and a shotgun gets stuck in our face immediately with all kinds of questions, and the guy's sweating and he's pissed off and we're having all kinds of issues. That was the first time where I realized making peace by leveraging your verbal skills is going to be absolutely paramount here. I mean, of course, I pretended like, hey, this happens to me every day. When are you going to put it down? Whatever. But at the same time, I'm thinking about where I'm gonna roll over and pop him in the eyeball before he shoots my partner. So it was a nutso situation. I found several instances, not only in personal experiences that dealt with me directly, but watching how they dealt with people who didn't turn in their money on time or came up short. I mean, these people were put in the hospital, or they drive by and shoot their houses up and hit either them or hit someone else. I mean, it's gang violence, so that was really part of the thing that you want to stop. But they were really all about respect, to a ridiculous extent, really. It's all about respect, which is why I say you can compare it to a corporation, except the hierarchy is everything in the gang world. You have to respect to the nth degree the person that's above you, or you cannot succeed. It's not really about the culture of the gang. I think if the gang's ever figured out that it's really about the crips and how they're perceived and how we as a team can make this work, even though they work in a hierarchical system, I think we'd all be in trouble because they'd be way too organized for anybody to handle.
Yeah. Before you went undercover, you were filmed in the show Cops. And can you tell the story of when that episode happened to come on, when you were actually in the room?
Yeah.
Undercover.
Yeah, people always say, so what was the scariest moment, when we talk about all these guns and everything else. And I was kind of prepared for stuff like, there's going to be guns, there's going to be people that are asking questions, separating you and everything else. But I was not prepared for a day. I pulled up on a guy who seemed like a good target, who was, by the time I ran into this guy, I'd already established myself. I was Tee from the West Side. Everybody knew who I was, and I had more people asking me to sell to them than I was asking to buy in the street at that point, because I'd just been out there every single day and night for I was probably there for a good eight or 9 months undercover at that time. So my whole intention was to move from dealer to dealer and create the conspiracy case, but I didn't want to just get with dealers. I had to get with dealers that were in the Crip network. I was trying to get actual Crips. So this guy was an okay target. He was kind of hitting me up and wanted to do some business with me and had some good stuff, blah, blah, blah. And I had somebody in the car with me who was kind of like, yeah, man, he's square and everything else. So we roll up to this cat's house, first time I'd met him, little shotgun house. We walk in, there's a couch on the right, coffee table with a gun, scale, some dope, big screen TV, pretty much nothing else in the house besides that. And then they proceed to sit down while we're chit-chatting, and we're talking about how much I need and this and that. The whole premise of that whole deal, by the way, was for me to hook up the guy that I was riding with, because I'm supposed to be big time. So I'm just throwing this buddy some cash so he can get his hustle going. And I hear a familiar voice in the background and immediately became terrified, because I realized this is back before everyone had 8,000 channels. We had whatever the 3 major networks or 4, and then a couple of UHF channels. And I was on a Cops episode many years prior, and there was my butt on Cops on the big screen TV at the moment that I walked in this house trying to do a deal. So you had mentioned that, I had longer hair, but I was a little shaggy, but I didn't have like actually long hair. I mean, I feel like I looked a lot like I do now, honestly. And that actually terrified me, because I was absolutely unprepared for something like that. And when people ask what I said or what I did, I know what I did, but I can't remember what I said, because it was a panic move. I stood in front of the TV and filibustered for the 4.5 minute, whatever it was. And I'm talking, and the guy that I brought with me is looking at me weird, like, why are you acting so fidgety? And we ended up doing the deal. I could not believe it. I wasn't this nervous, and they were filming the episode. I can't believe it's this freaking long. I mean, this is taking forever to bring a commercial. The commercial finally comes on, and we're able to bolt, and the guy I was with he thought I was acting strangely, but didn't really even notice anything on the TV at the time. It was a dodged bullet for sure.
Yeah, because I mean, my husband, I don't usually watch that show, but it's on sometimes. My husband loves this show, and I think about, because they are up close, and
Yeah.
those cops are right there, and I think about that. Now, you're married to Holly at this point, and this is Holly, Tegan's beautiful wife. And do you go home at night, or do you have another place, or were you ever worried about being followed? And what kind of, I mean, I'm sure it was stressful to just go home and be normal, which might not have happened, but how did you and how did Holly figure out how to?
Yeah, I can set that up, and then if maybe she wanted to comment on it or tell me where I'm going wrong, because usually that's the case. I sat down with her and actually came to an agreement before I launched into this project. And so I had her support in the beginning, which was absolutely necessary. I did have on paper another place, but this whole thing started through police department funds, through narcotics unit, which was crap. It was really not that much money. I was rolling in with, I'd have 5 or 10 20s and then 100 ones stacked on it, so I looked like I was rolling hot. And buy a little sample of that. So we had a house that was designated that I leveraged at a couple of different times, but of course I'm not showing people my house or trying to prove anything by it. But other than the couple of times that I rolled by there, I went home every single night, which was what made the story more extraordinary, because I started this whole thing in my backyard. And then you go to the same mall and you go to the same everything else when you're not actually on duty. So it's pretty whack overall. You're just always kind of on 10 with your antenna. And she's obviously nervous. She is very inquisitive and interested in a lot of what's going on. But she also was smart enough to know what she didn't need to know. So sometimes I would just get to a point where I would say, this is who I'm dealing with, and they kind of are a little uptight right now, and she would know when to kind of let that be the case. I did every single night on more than one occasion would do what they call heat runs, which is what dealers would do typically, where you pull out, you make the block, and you essentially make a bunch of left-hand turns and make sure the same car that you left that was behind you isn't still behind you, or else they're following you. By the time you complete your square, obviously, unless you're both lost at the same time, it's not usually what happens. So I did on one occasion, and I didn't even include this in the book because it's so anticlimactic, because I never found out who did it, but I had my window shut out on my way home one night, but I hadn't crossed anybody. I didn't know what was going on, and so I was uber careful, yes, in going home and trying to secret the location that I was at. I was at a time too where internet wasn't as prominent. The internet existed, but it wasn't like people could just Google stuff and find 80 pictures of any given person at any given time as well. And she used to just stay up. She had a real job, but she'd stay up and wait. I'd come home 3:30 in the morning, and she'd be up on the living room couch waiting for me to get home. So you want to talk about that? Want to add to any of that?
Am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah, I mean, pretty much just what he said. I'm a worry monger, so, you know, this operation was only supposed to go a few months, and it ended up being 18 months. So after the FBI picked it up, it kind of grew into this big thing. And so he would leave in the middle of the night, and so I would get up and go into the living room and wait, because, like he said, it's before, now you can share locations and do things like that. That was before all that, iPhones and all that. So I had no idea where he was, and I couldn't call him because I didn't know what he was going to be doing. And so it was, we had an understanding that I would only call him unless it was an emergency. So it was lots of sleepless nights. And
Yeah, she was a stud, because, like I said, she just did it because she just worries.
yeah,
But
I had a great boss too, who didn't know, like, nobody knew like what he was doing, because I certainly didn't want to, tell anybody. I mean, they knew he worked in narcotics and stuff, but I worked at a CPA firm at the time. My boss was very nice, and
understand.
she was flexible with me. So
Coming in after 2 hours of sleep.
yeah.
Yeah.
And something that was supposed to go on for 3 months, but went on for 18 months. When did you, and I know the FBI came in,
Yeah.
and so then at least you had more money to.
That's, yeah.
But how did you know you were close to the end? How do you know, like, when it's time to make the arrests and all of that?
That was one of the more frustrating parts about it, because once you get in that far, you almost just, someone has to make you stop. Because I was trying to get, obviously, to the head of the snake in the Crip network, but by the time I was able to get to that, then I wanted to get the Mexican source that was bringing all the weight across. I mean, this guy's saying, here's $100,000 in cash, and this Hispanic guy's driving off with it and coming back an hour later. I thought, I mean, even street dealers aren't going to let $20 walk away, and this guy's throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars down, and it just seemed righteous to me to try to go that route. Of course, he's not a Crip, but he's contributing to the overall issue that was creating part of the problem with the neighborhood. But the U.S. attorney eventually just said, we're taking this case, this is where the case stops, wind it up. You have about 2 weeks to wind it up. And so I went into a panic mode at that point and hit a big 4-tray day. It was an actual day of celebration for the Crips, and they actually got a permit from the city to use the city park and everything else, and it was just overflowing with people. And so I got a couple guys, and who again were, by that time, were all bad guys, but we were all kind of pals around and did a bunch of deals together and everything else at that point. So I kind of loaded up my posse of bad guys, and we rolled down there and tried to make last minute deals to try to suture up a lot of these cases. And of course, they're perceiving it as I'm rolling out trying to enjoy the 4-tray picnic, for what that's worth. We ended up rounding up 51 people at the end of the entire thing. So it was a large conspiracy, obviously 51 people, federally, 41 went federally. So there was some significant time spent there, but that's how it ended. It put me in a state of mind that was just so compulsive, and once you're there, you're thinking you've done all this. So where do you say, I'm satisfied and this is over? There's really kind of not an end to it. So it was going to be the U.S. attorney or it was going to be Holly, and I think those are the only two people that were going to eventually say, here's the axe and this is where it cuts out. And the U.S. attorney did it before she did. I think she appreciated what was going on too, as concerned as she became with me and my stress and how our relationship was fine, but was being punished by my behavior and lack of sleep and her lack of sleep and everything else. I think she was still supportive and wanting to see it end successfully. But the U.S. attorney essentially is the one that said, guess what, you're done.
Yeah, yeah. Because it could go on and on and on. You want to get people, you want to get more people.
Yeah.
But these people you worked with, did you become close to them? Were you at their trials? Were there deals made? Did you have any people you got close to who kind of saw?
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Maybe they could do something else later after they.
Yeah, and it was very difficult. You know, when you spend a year and a half with somebody 6-7 days a week, a lot of these guys, it became difficult when it came time to round them up. And sitting across the table from some of these guys, I had mixed emotions. Some guys were like, screw you, I'm not going to even say a word. Other guys were, I had one where I would sit on the side of the table with the FBI agent who was leading the federal prosecution end. And they would be sitting across the table, and she would be real accusatory about what they were doing, and we know you were moving this and blah, blah, blah. And he would say, no, it's not true. Tell her, T, it's not true. And, you know, and it was, you know, so it makes it an interesting perspective that they, you know, after that long, they still couldn't really buy into the fact that I was on the other side. And I almost felt the same way. I was like, almost like, man, I'm kind of in the middle. I'm doing something that's important and this has to happen. But I'm also the people that I really liked. I'm like inside, just like, dude, I really want you to cooperate because I'm going to do everything I can in my power to help you during the prosecution phase. But that's also unrealistic. You know, what are you supposed to do? Say, hey, man, it's been a year and a half and you just found out that I've been stoking you the entire time. But trust me, if, you know, so I know the irony of it, but in my mind, it was an earnest feeling. I mean, I really had compassion for the guys. Some of them needed to go away and never come back, honestly. But there were several who I considered rehabilitatable, if that's a word. Probably isn't, but you know what I mean. And I just, you know, had high hopes for them. And I did actually testify on several behalf. And once that happened, that was kind of in the middle of the prosecutory phase. So once people saw that I was willing to go up and testify and encourage the judge to, you know, take consideration that I thought that they had some promise in life and everything else and that they didn't need to do extraordinary time, then people started coming forth and trying to cooperate. And essentially, you know, with these guys, we weren't trying to find more dope houses by that time. I mean, this was a gang case. You say, okay, you're looking at 20 years. This is what we have. We put it together. We did all these deals with T. The information that we looked for were murders and things like that. We solved 9 murders off of these people cooperating because that's what we're interested in. At that point, we weren't interested in some trap house. You know, we'd had enough of that.
And at the end of your book, after the arrest, and you know, as I was reading it, kind of, okay, that's over, and that's the story. But what made me think when I was reading this book is all the consequences afterwards, because the arrest happened, and of course you have the emotional consequence afterwards of living in this, but also the families. And the place I work is a place called Hope Farm. And Hope Farm is in the inner city of Fort Worth, which is about 6 or 7 minutes away from the Fishbowl. And it's a place it's an after school and summer camp for boys without fathers. And the fathers are the ones who, some of them were in that group.
Displaced.
right? And so, I see the consequences every day. I don't know the dads, but you talk about I think there were 104 children who
Yeah.
were left fatherless when
Yeah.
these guys left. And did you have any contact with families, with the girlfriends or the wives of these men who were involved?
I did, and I have even recently, the majority of the contact I've had with the families was, I'm gonna kill you and your family. But the other contact I did have were people that actually came around and either saw, the whole purpose behind the book is to support charities like Hope Farm in particular. In fact, I donate all of the profits, 100% of the profits from this book go to that charity. It's something that I wasn't going to write a book. I mean, after this came out and it blew up and it was in papers and media, people are like, oh, you have to write a book. And I'm thinking, well, I've been a musician. I already know, I know how to live broke already. I don't need things better from this point.
Right, and I find at Hope Farm, these boys are so hungry for male role models, and that's how the gangs get to them, because they'll give them a small job here, a small job there, and we have kids 8, 9 who go to the schools that our kids go to, and they're already part of a gang, and so having male role models is so important for these boys. You said you weren't in law enforcement, and I want to open it up for questions after this, but can you talk a little bit about your company and what you do now?
Sure, yeah. I wrapped up Fishbowl and tried to do one more of those operations. I'm not sure how she approved of that, but I tried, and Fishbowl was just so star-aligned type things, where things just worked out so well that it was fortunate that it happened. This other project was just, after it garnered so much attention, there was just too many upper-level people that were interested in having their fingers in the pie, and the vast majority of the Fishbowl operation was me going out by myself. There was no wires, there's no backup, there's no nothing. It was just people letting me go do what I do, which is rare, if not non-existent. So after, again, consulting with Holly and saying, hey, let's do something with no risk, like quit the police department, start a company. There's no risk in that, right? So we decided, yes, we would do that. She held down the fort with her. She handled some private wealth clients at the time, again, working with a CPA and an attorney doing the accounting stuff, and built a company on investigations and security. A few of our guys are here today. If you've seen them, then please shake their hand, because they are hardworking folks and they are amazing. But yeah, Tactical Systems Network is the name of the company, and we've been in business for 11 years since, and it's been awesome. I've even gotten back into the music business a little bit here recently, so it just has allowed me to get to a point in my life where I get to do some things that I love to do again, and hopefully leverage the book as a way to further the message about how drugs can affect people's lives so adversely, and gang life, and ultimately how children with proper mentoring can learn about this before they start falling into some of those holes.
Yeah, because it is hard when you're born into it, and some of these kids are born into a family situation where it seems like there's no chance. And so it is, places like Hope Farm can help, and the mentoring and things that you do outside of the Tactical Systems Network. Are there any questions for Tegan or Holly? Oh, yeah.
No questions.
Is it working?
No dumb questions, by the way. It's fine, whatever direction you want to go with it, ma'am.
Did you have to do drugs?
That's always a great question. All right. Yeah, so we play by a set of rules, right? It makes it really disadvantageous to do it. And that was part of my whole vibe was, look, I'm on probation for an aggravated assault. Part of what I did was not only visit these guys when I wasn't doing transactions, but I would also go downtown and take a piss test with everyone else at the county. So I got to know some of the guys down there. So they knew I was on probation, and I ain't about to break probation for you. I'm trying to do this hustle and make me some money. If you want to do business, cool. If you want to sit here and do a bump, you enjoy yourself. I got business to run, so I'll see you later. And if you want to make money off me, usually you'll say, well, hang on a second, because otherwise I'm going to go to your neighbor and make money. So no is the answer. It was always a consideration. And being armed was another thing, you know, whether, because I'm always carrying, so that was always the thing. Sometimes they would ask about that, but that was one thing that I had to get around. That's how I did it.
We have one over here.
I have a question for Holly. How hard is it for you not to like ask a million questions all the time and just want to know everything? Especially for 18 months.
Yeah, actually very hard. So I'm nosy. So I'm super nosy. So yes, the reason I didn't ask a lot of questions though, that I told myself, because I really wanted to let him do this, because I know it's something that he really wanted to do, and I wanted to be supportive. And even after it went longer than I thought it was gonna go, I still really wanted to be supportive. So I tried not to, because, you know, sometimes I would ask a little too much, and then I would, you know, get to where it would just make me worry more. So, and I did worry a lot, you know, it was really hard, like, you know, one time when he came home, and I could tell that he had been in a fight, because he, you know, had visible signs of, you know, being in a fist fight, and that was really hard. So I just really and truly, I just prayed, and I was just like, I know that he would tell me if it was something that was either going to be, you know, harmful to me or, you know, my stepson. So I just really tried to just trust him and not ask a bunch of questions, even though I was really wanted to. So when he started writing the book, like after it happened, like, you know, after the roundup or whatever, I sat in on some of the trials, which was also super emotional, because I felt so much compassion to the people too that I had never met before, and, you know, that I won't get into, because it's like, you know, it goes into their lives, you know, when they, you know, choose to take the stand and they tell their life story, you know, about that might be, you know, like some of yours, about, you know, life of, you know, they lived in a life of drugs, they turned to drugs, whatever, and it's really hard to not have compassion for those people. So, but I was the first editor when he wrote this book, and some of the things that I read in there, I was just like, you're crazy, you know, are you crazy, you know? So I was glad, you know, at the end that I didn't ask the questions at the time, because I probably would have said, you know, you can't do this because I'm afraid you're not going to come home with
But
it.
she still did know a lot too. It's
I did
not
know,
like
I did know a
wasn't
lot.
like-
I just didn't know, like, so like the cops thing, like I didn't know, you know, any of that. And
She would have ended
Yeah,
it.
I would've-
That
oh,
would have been,
totally.
she would have said, that's it. I mean, there's no way, because I had to go do a deal the next day.
Yeah.
And figure out how to deal with that. And then she would have just said, nope.
But it's really hard, you know, we went out in public, we would walk together, we wouldn't hold hands, we would walk together, but it was almost like if somebody comes to talk to him, I just act like I don't know him, you know? So that was really hard too, like going out in public, you know, if we stayed like around Fort Worth, it was really hard because, and it only happened one time, but it did happen one time that we were walking actually outside, just outside of downtown, and someone said T and started walking towards him, and I kind of froze for a minute, like, oh my gosh, like, so, and I just kept walking, like, just kept walking and just acted like I didn't even know him. So it was really hard to, and I didn't ask a bunch of questions about that guy, you know, because he stayed there forever too. I was like, you know, what is he doing? Like, is he ever going to come back, or, well, you know, where do I go, or what do I do? You know, do I go back to the car? You know, and then I don't want to do that because what if, you know, so anyway.
Any other questions?
Other questions?
Okay, now come up there. Okay, come back here.
How did you keep bounties from being put on you? afterwards? Like, did you ever hear of any?
Yeah, I didn't. Eventually, it just became kind of a part of what we dealt with, and to be honest, we deal with it to this day, because some of these folks are getting out. I do lean on the purpose behind the book on some of that. I don't expect everybody to have compassion. I mean, you see reviews on the book, and people are like, here's another guy trying to take advantage of a poor community just to make a dime and whatever, which is obviously not, I mean, I'm thousands of dollars in the hole on this book, but it doesn't mean everyone's going to know that or believe that. We had several death threats in the beginning, and are leveraging some of the people that I know in law enforcement now to kind of keep tabs on some of the folks that have gotten out, just to make sure, which is another reason why, even if it's a well-intended gesture to help, one of these kids or whatever that were related to those folks back then, when we helped them in the beginning, it made sense, because they were, you help a 4-year-old kid, or you bring presents for, all their nephews and all that. But now I just hope that they get out and find a new path. And there's not a whole lot I can do other than, we lock down at the house, and we've got the cameras and the blah, blah, blah. And the awareness of the fact that you never know, it kind of helps us too, kind of move around with hyper aware. But it obviously didn't pan out, the death threats in the beginning, but it doesn't mean it couldn't ever happen. I mean, wasn't an intention from the beginning, for sure.
What was your biggest deal in the dollar amount?
Biggest deal in dollar amount that's a good question too. My white stiff nerd price for a kilo was about $17.5 back then, and I did a 4-kilo deal. Again, a lot of what you'll find in the book is since I technically can't like take a brick of coke and move it into the street, I found bad guys that once I'd established relationships, I had bad guys that had my back. They were like, T, if anyone ever F's with you, I got your back, and this and that, and they were the tough guys. So I ran into some other guys who were trying to get their hustle started, who were the types that didn't have the gumption to go out and really get it done. So I would set up deals with their money for them and say, let's say you've got 50 grand and you want to go buy 3 kilos or something with it. You call me, because we have an arrangement. You call me and I call ahead and say, hey man, I'm gonna send Dave up to pick up some of my stuff. And that way you're kind of working under my protection at that point. And I'm able to stay in the game, and then your end of the deal was getting me into the people that are on your side of the neighborhood, because I'm trying to break out from the area where I'm at and try to get into some of your connections. So we kind of team up that way. So that way I didn't have to actually spend FBI money on that deal. It was a deal with a bad guy's money, moving bad guy dope from bad guy to dope, that I facilitated because they thought it was for me. Yes, ma'am?
I know it might have been a little different when you're a police officer, but do you think either then or now they're a little hesitant to send women undercover?
Would I be now?
Is the department hesitant to send women undercover?
No, actually not. What you'll find though is that if the department had the department known the way I was working when I worked, they would have also shut it down. I had a boss that really believed in me because I'd worked for him before. He knew I was working, but I literally broke every rule in the book and would just come back and report to him, which is why we could replicate this case. Because when somebody calls at 1:30 in the morning and says, we got a shipment was rolling in, you interested, blah, 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 and I just get up and head out there and do it. I don't have time to call it 8-man team, a bunch of dorks and explorers and earpieces that look so obvious. You know what I mean? And at the time, the wires were just like in the movies. It was ridiculous. You're taping it to your chest, and I was like, really? Come on. So there was no way I was doing that. And so I worked without it, and that's where all the progress came in. And that's why I leveraged things like that for the money too, because I had to come up with creative ways to keep my name as the big timer. So if they're moving 4 kilos and I can facilitate that deal and not spend a dime, then the department doesn't even have to know it until the end. But the way it runs now, to answer your question, not at all. I think they would encourage it. I mean, I think it's less about really fitting into a specific role as much as it is your ability to really know what you're doing and have the confidence to go in there and do it. A lot of it's about the confidence, which is what I hoped to prove when, in my deal, going down there, because everyone that sees me is like, eh. So yeah, women all about it.
I'm stepped out, so I don't know if this was asked or not, but how did you yourself not fall into the pitfall of addiction? I mean, you're around it all the time, you're around those men. I'm sure that was maybe a concern as a wife, I'm not sure, but how did you refrain from that?
I saw it from a healthy perspective to start with. So my compassion and concern only grew as I witnessed more of it from the inside, honestly. It wasn't something that tempted me. There was an appreciation for kind of a culture of that kind of, when you got your game going and you got your music cranked up and you're doing some bad stuff, everybody's got guns, everyone feels badass and whatever, but there wasn't really a lot of drug use, and except for at the bottom level where a lot of the guys at that level were, I was seeing so much of the punishment. These guys getting beat senseless for turning in, $10 short and this and that. So it was almost reinforcing my feeling about how to get people help as opposed to falling into the pitfall. And I know you left for her question whether or not they made me take any or whatever. I would skirt that question by being on probation and go downtown and take a urine test with all these people every week. And I would just tell them I'm not willing to, to put my freedom on the line for you. I'm trying to do business. So that was kind of my way to avoid that whole topic. Once you get to a certain level, this is all a business, money. It's bigger than that. It's at that street level where you have a lot of the tumultuous type of things that happen. And I felt even more compassion when I got done than when I started.
During the process of you doing your job as an undercover, what was your most fearful moment?
It has to be hands down the cops episode. Has to be it really was. I have several moments that I name in the book that talk and drawn out. I never do them justice, just whipping it out because I'm not trying to be braggadocious. So there was a guy that essentially, I got a call from an informant and said, hey man, so-and-so has put a jacket on you. So in the street, it's essentially labeling you as an informant, which is worse than being labeled a cop, because an informant's going to end up in a ditch and a cop's going to end up, who knows. And at the time, it was in close proximity to that stupid cops thing. And so when they call me and say that somebody says that you're a snitch, I was super concerned about that. And obviously, I was so far in that I couldn't stop, but not far in enough to stop. So the only thing that I did was sit back and try to talk myself into, if I'm really the part that I am, like I'm T from the West Side, what does T from the West Side do when someone says, hey man, I think you're a snitch? Well, you go beat his ass. And that's essentially what I did. I set my alarm early that morning. I knew that he made drops and dropped a quarter key at a little trap house under the carport. And then I met him there, and that's when we got into it. And that was, I felt like it was a decent fight, but I don't think he stood much of a chance, honestly. I wasn't trying to pick fights with people all the time, but I knew that if that was out there, it had to be nipped in the bud absolutely immediately. So that's what happened. It was sort of one-sided, but there's licks traded, so yeah, that's fine. It wasn't nothing terrible.
Yeah, this is kind of a psychological question, but What would you say was really motivating you to go into undercover work to begin with? I mean, did you have any experiences? You're kind of risking your life. So I didn't know if there was any things from your past or kind of seeing after also like what you've done since then. I didn't know if there's any relationship between those things or.
Oh, awesome. Excellent question. I had actually worked in patrol capacity around the Fishbowl in the past, which makes the Fishbowl operation even more idiotic. But Holly and I had even gone to homes where I'd answered domestic calls, and the kids were sent across the street, but they'd witnessed knives being pulled, and people were hit with pans and bleeding, and there was all this nonsense going on. These kids were just putting up with all this stuff. And it was one of those types of things when the Fishbowl you go in too deep every single time. And watching those kids, I might called her, told her about it. We hit a Walmart, came back, gave the kids a bunch of Christmas stuff and whatever at their aunt's house, right? It was across the street in the Fishbowl. And the aunt was almost put out that we were there. She's like, why are you here? We don't need all this stuff. She was already annoyed, the fact that she had to watch the kids. And so it made me concerned for the people that were in that neighborhood. When you pull in, you've got prostitutes on one end and dudes sitting on the roof with radios, making sure that you're coming in to do business, they know who you are. And I saw people who had children. I saw old people who have been living there for 50 years, and you say, well, there's too much gang violence, why don't you just move? Well, you can't just afford to move, you know? These people aren't living in under the best of means, and they've been in that home for 50 years. Why don't the gangbangers freaking move, which is part of my motivation. I saw a whole lot of devastation around that neighborhood, and I really wanted to see that aspect go away. It wasn't really, I mean, nobody's gonna make drugs go away the way we're addressing it at this point, at least law enforcement wise. But again, I leveraged that to get into the violent end, those people that leverage, the crip tactics to move their dope and essentially hold hostage an entire neighborhood of people who are just trying to make it. And so that was kind of the premise. And following that, I think it's really, I've had plenty of experiences with people in my family, people in our friends' family who have had terrible experiences and deaths from overdoses. And I'm working on yet another case, even outside of law enforcement, and trying to get a guy prosecuted that ended up causing, in my opinion, the suicide of a friend of ours. So it goes deep and wide, and doing talks like this and just sharing the experience and helping people be enlightened about ways that we can fix it and keep these things from being so cyclical, whether it's gang violence or it's falling into the pitfalls of drugs. If you can mentor a lot of these people at an earlier age and help them to recognize when that comes, they recognize what it is, and they have alternatives because they've been educated and they've been empowered and they have accountability and they become stronger people, it helps curb it. I mean, that's only one aspect, right? I mean, I know there's people coming out of prison, there's people that are still dealing with it, and you can't ignore all that. There's 100 different ways to do it. I just try to share my experience so that hopefully somebody grabs a tidbit from the story and is able to leverage that to inspire others or themselves or whatever. And I'm always open, to helping people that have drug issues. It pisses me off when people will watch like one of the Cops episodes, the arrested drug dealer, and they're like, oh, great waste of cop resources. It's just a user. Why are you even bothering? And that pisses me off because I've seen the consequences of the user. It's not just, hey, it's the same with gang members. Hey, just let the gang members kill each other and then we're all fine. It doesn't work like that. And I know that, and you know that. So part of it is just painting a picture of ways that we can get around that ridiculous kind of a outlook from other people who are just not educated about why substance abuse happens and how it works from behind the scenes and how it affects families and how that family's trauma affects other families in their neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the kids join a gang or the kids, whatever, fall into the same thing, no matter how traumatic. Sometimes the kid coming up behind that terrible incident goes and does the exact same thing. We've seen it.
We have one more question, and then Tegan's going to be here signing books, so if you have more questions that you'd like to ask or don't feel comfortable asking it in the group, you'd be open to
Oh,
asking.
yeah.
Okay, we have
I'll
one
be
more.
over here. Everyone gets a book and they're, whatever you need. Oh, you got the gun, the big one.
Do you know if statistically crime has gone down since 11 years ago, whenever like all that stuff happened?
That's also a very good question. The Fishbowl neighborhood itself is, in my opinion, transformed. Is it a great place to live? No, but it is remarkably improved. And even as I wrote the book, and obviously the book came out several years after I'd completed the operation, I went down there myself as a reporter. I've sent law enforcement down there to assess. We look at crime stats, and it's been very much improved. A lot of it's just, the idea is you tear down the dilapidated houses, clean up the areas. People come and actually buy the other houses that were being leased out to some woman named Danica, whose name is in, the bills are in her name, but everyone else is doing bad stuff out of the house, and that goes away. So then you have accountability from a real estate perspective too. So is it great? Absolutely not. I mean, I wouldn't want to live there, but it is at least 65% better than it was. I mean, you couldn't go down there without 2 police units to answer a call. I mean, it was bad. So, and it's a small part of town, I'll be honest with you. But the idea is, you see how it can work. So if we can model that and come around with the Hope Farm type stuff, education about drugs and gang violence, how can we do that little piece at a time? If I'm not the only one doing it, then we could all make a difference together for sure.
And I drove by the Fishbowl recently, and it's much better. And we were driving by and looking at something else, and Victor said, "Oh, there's the Fishbowl." I said, "That's the Fishbowl?" I said, "Okay, all right." And it's kind of like Hope Farm started by renovating one crack house, and we were in a house for 6 years with some of the kids, and now it's a whole city block. We got house after house after houses, and then the houses across the street got painted, and so it's like one person at a time,
A little bit.
one house at a time.
A little bit. And there's stuff over here, information about Hope Farm. I'd say everyone that wants a book, there's obviously books over here. If you ever want to reach out, we're here for you. It's an honor to be here. It's great meeting a lot of you folks. Really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Before you move on, so we wanted Tegan, come down here.
Oh, yeah.
So I can show you.
Crip Blue.
Yeah. One of the things, this is our staff shirt, and we wanted to give one to you, to your wife, to Becky, and to your team that's out here.
Love it.
Right, honorary staff members for making a difference in this industry. One of the most beautiful things of your cause is that you're healing families from the inside out while trying to clean up this issue that we have out there that we're all here to fight, whether we've been in it or have worked near it. So we wanted to give you all this, and we have a gift for you to take home too.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.